to the strike that was taken against Soleimani.
President Trump also defended the intelligence, but walked back an earlier threat to attack Iranian cultural sites.
And we are, according to various laws, supposed to be very careful with their cultural heritage. And you know what? If that's what the law is, I like to obey the law.
On Capitol Hill, lawmakers continued their clash over President Trump's Iran policy. Top Senate Democrat Chuck Schumer.
The president has promised that he would not drag the American people into another endless war in the Middle East. The president's actions, however, have seemingly increased the risk that we could be dragged into exactly such a war.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell.
When he enforces his red lines, when he takes real action to counter lethal threats against Americans.
Administration officials are briefing Congress today and tomorrow, trying to create bipartisan support as they await Iran's response. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Nick Schifrin.
We'll have more on the Iran situation later in the program after the news summary. In the day's other news, Russia's President Vladimir Putin traveled to Syria as the U.S. confrontation with Iran roiled the Middle East. Syrian state media released images of Putin meeting with President Bashar al-Assad in Damascus. The men also met with military commanders. Russia intervened in the Syrian war in 2015. In the U.S. Senate, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell announced that Republicans have agreed on rules for President Trump's impeachment trial. He said he has the votes to delay a decision on calling witnesses until after opening statements. That same process was used in President Clinton's impeachment trial.
What was good enough for President Clinton in an impeachment trial should have been good enough for President Trump. And all we're doing here is saying we're going to get started in exactly the same way that 100 senators agreed to 20 years ago.
Democrats say the situation is different now because the Trump White House blocked key officials from testifying to House investigators. And Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer says he's not giving up.
I am not only hopeful, but I think there's a pretty decent chance that we're going to get enough Republicans to vote for witnesses and documents during this trial. If there's no witnesses and documents, we will have the ability at the beginning of the trial and as we go through it to get votes, and we're going to get them.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has refused to send articles of impeachment to the Senate in a bid to press for witness testimony. We'll dig into this more later in the program. The U.S. Justice Department called today for Michael Flynn, President Trump's former national security advisor, to serve up to 6 months in prison. In a court filing, federal prosecutors said that Flynn stopped cooperating in the Russia investigation and has attacked them instead. He faces sentencing in 3 weeks for lying to the FBI. Doctored videos known as deep fakes. They use artificial intelligence and other tools to generate false but realistic video clips. The company says it is part of an effort to fight online disinformation. The Trump administration today proposed rescinding a rule against racial segregation in housing. The Obama-era standard mandates local plans to address the problem. The Department of Housing and Urban Development said today that the rule is overly burdensome. And on Wall Street, worries about Iran welled up again today and pushed stocks down. The Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 119 points to close at 28,583. The Nasdaq fell about 3 points, and the S&P 500 slipped 9. Still to come on the NewsHour, we speak with Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders just weeks before the Iowa caucuses. The standoff between Senator McConnell and Speaker Pelosi over Trump's impeachment trial, and much more.
This is the PBS NewsHour from WETA Studios in Washington and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Democratic presidential candidates have been speaking about Iran as they seek to contrast their foreign policy visions against that of the current commander-in-chief. In New York City, former Vice President Joe Biden said President Trump's decision to strike out at Qasem Soleimani was dangerously incompetent.
So the question is, was the reward of removing a bad actor worth the risk of what comes next? We don't have evidence to suggest that Trump or anyone around him thought seriously about that calculus.
Meanwhile, in an interview with ABC today, Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren expressed again her own doubt that the president made the right move.
He is. He's part of a group that our federal government has designated as a terrorist. The question, though, is what's the right response? And the response that Donald Trump has picked is the most incendiary and has moved us right to the edge of war.
And joining us now from Burlington to discuss the Soleimani attack and more, Democratic presidential candidate and independent senator from Vermont, Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders, thank you very much for being with us again. Let me ask you first about Iran. You've criticized President Trump for targeting the killing of General Soleimani. You've called it an assassination. But if the administration is able to produce hard evidence that he was going to attack Americans, would you then say this was justified?
Well, yeah, that's a hypothesis. We haven't seen that evidence. Frankly, I doubt that evidence is there. Judy, what is going on right now feels to me exactly what I saw in 2002 and 2003, and that was the lead up and the justification for the war in Iraq. I opposed that war vigorously, and it turned out to be one of the worst foreign policy blunders in the history of the United States. A war with Iran would likely be even worse. So I will do all that I can to make sure that in this instance and in other instances, we solve international conflict diplomatically and that we try to put an end to endless wars.
Senator, you've said that this was in violation of international law. So does that mean you believe President Trump has committed a war crime?
Look, when you go around assassinating leadership in governments, you are setting a precedent which says to any country on earth, hey, all we got to do is name these people terrorists, call them what you want, and we can assassinate them. I think the world and this country is sick and tired of endless wars that have cost us trillions of dollars while our infrastructure is collapsing, our healthcare system is dysfunctional. We have to deal with climate change and invest heavily in transforming our energy system. Judy, in my view, we do not need to spend trillions of dollars more in a war.
Very quickly on Iraq, you have called previously for removing U.S. troops from Iraq. As you know, the Iraqi parliament has said U.S. troops should leave. Would you, as president, have U.S. troops pulled out?
Look, I want U.S. troops out of Iraq. I've wanted that for a long time. But you bring them out in a measured, intelligent way, working with the Iraqi government and with our international allies. What's happened here, after the loss of 4,500 American lives, hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, trillions of dollars, essentially we are being booted out of Iraq. So do I want to end the war there in Iraq and bring American troops home? Absolutely. That is what I'll do as president. But I don't, it's a sad state of affairs to see, after all of this sacrifice, to see our troops booted out of the country.
Senator, a couple of questions on domestic policy. There are polls now that show most voters would prepare to build on Obamacare rather than go to a single-payer system, which is what you advocate.
Well, depending on the poll that you look at, the vast majority of people in the Democratic primaries absolutely support a Medicare for all single-payer system, because they understand that when we are spending twice as much per capita as the people of any other country, and yet 87 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, 500,000 people go bankrupt because of medically related bills, all at the same time as the healthcare industry and the drug companies made $100 billion in profit last year. People understand this system has got to change. And my own view is that after 100 years of talk in this country about the need to guarantee healthcare for all, now is the time to take on the greed and corruption of the drug companies and the insurance companies, expand Medicare, and provide a Medicare for all, single-payer system for all. It will cost the average American substantially less than what he or she is paying today. That is the direction we've got to go in.
Well, in connection with that, Senator, you recently acknowledged that a lot of people would lose jobs in a transition to Medicare for all. You talked just recently about a program to provide jobs, to provide job training for people who lose their jobs under the program. Are you guaranteeing that people who lose their jobs under this new system would have a job?
We have built in a very generous transition period. One of the reasons we're spending twice as much per person as any other country on health care is we have enormous administrative waste. We have all kinds of people in the bureaucracy administering thousands of separate health insurance plans. We need more doctors, nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors. We need people to deal with the crisis of opioid addiction. We don't need more people just arguing for representing the insurance companies, telling us that we're not covered when we thought we were. So we have a very generous transition period, but at the end of the day, Medicare for all will create more jobs in healthcare than we will lose, because when you open the doors to healthcare for all Americans, we're going to need more practitioners, more people providing healthcare, not just filling out forms and having a massive bureaucracy.
Something else, Senator, in recent days, you've been saying you don't believe Joe Biden can win this election because you said he'd bring a lot of baggage. You said you don't think he'd create the kind of excitement and energy that's needed to defeat President Trump. Are you saying absolutely he would lose to President Trump?
No. I'm not saying that at all. I think that I happen to believe, it will not shock you, I am sure, that I am the strongest candidate to defeat Trump. But I think other Democrats, including Joe Biden, can do it as well. But here's my point. To beat Trump, you're going to need a massive voter turnout. And the only way you do that is through a campaign of energy, of excitement. You got to bring working people, you got to bring young people into the political process. The truth is, as I think most people know, Joe Biden voted for the war in Iraq. Joe voted for disastrous trade agreements like NAFTA and PNTR, which cost us millions of jobs. Joe voted for a bankruptcy bill, which really has hurt working class families. Joe was on the floor of the Senate talking about, in his view, the need to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. I think Trump will have a field day with that. And I just don't think that the Biden campaign can create the energy and the excitement we need to defeat the worst president in the modern history of this country.
So I know you believe you'd win the nomination, but as you said, if you didn't, you prepared to support Mr. Biden.
Absolutely.
What about, I want to ask you about one of the other candidates, though, because you have talked a lot about the billionaire class. Would you be prepared to support Mike Bloomberg if he were the nominee?
I will support, look, as I have said many times, I think that in Trump we have a pathological liar, the leader of a corrupt administration, a racist, a sexist, a homophobe, a xenophobe. I will support any Democrat who wins the nomination. Hopefully, I will be supporting myself.
Senator Bernie Sanders joining us from Burlington, Vermont. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now we turn back to the impeachment standoff on Capitol Hill, a clash that features two familiar figures, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell and the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. For more on all this, Lisa Desjardins.
The impeachment process against President Trump remains essentially stuck in neutral tonight, with still no word on when House Speaker Nancy Pelosi may transmit those articles of impeachment and spark a Senate trial. To make sense of the impasse between Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell, I'm joined by two Capitol Hill veterans who previously worked as their top aides. Nadeem Al-Shami was Pelosi's chief of staff from 2013 to 2017 when she was House Minority Leader. Stephen Law was McConnell's chief of staff from 1991 to 1996. That's before McConnell became Majority Leader in the Senate. Law currently runs the Senate Leadership Fund. Thank you, two chiefs of staff. No one knows these two leaders better. Nadeem, I want to start with you. Speaker Pelosi is trying to do something unprecedented here, use timing to change the shape of a Senate trial, to get more witnesses, as we've reported. What is the strategy here, and how do you think she looks at any risks of that strategy? What's she doing?
Well, I think what she's doing here is very important. We got to take a step back. And it took 5 weeks for the impeachment articles of President Clinton to be transmitted to the Senate.
I think it was 3 weeks, but I hear you.
So we're close. And at the moment, what she's focusing on is the Constitution. You know, this is absolutely critical issues before our country. The House did vote on articles of impeachment. However, the president and the White House demanded that none of the witnesses that the House wanted that know directly from the president to come before Congress and testify. Now, the point is, what kind of pressure can she put on Leader McConnell? And we've seen over the past few weeks, you have Ambassador Bolton said he's willing to testify if he's subpoenaed. More evidence has come out. And the president continues to say some pretty interesting things on Twitter.
Stephen Law, do you think Leader McConnell is feeling any pressure? To some people, he's kind of an enigma. Not to you who've worked with him. What do you think is going on behind the scenes with him right now? Is he feeling any of this pressure?
You know, I don't think he's feeling pressure particularly. I mean, one of the things about the Senate is that it, not just Leader McConnell, but there's a sense of institutional prerogative. And, you know, you look at the Constitution, which governs this, and it doesn't say a lot, but it says some very simple things. First of all, the House has the sole power to impeach, and the Senate has the sole power to try the case. And the operative word in both of those is sole. Each one has its own respective role, and you can't try to dictate the role of the other. And I think that Speaker Pelosi made, in my view, a miscalculation trying to think that she could force Leader McConnell's hand or the Senate's hand to do something that he was not inclined to do, at least with respect to agree to somebody else's process being put on him. And I think that is actually now starting to fall apart.
We're talking about these two leaders, but I want to hear from them. I want to play some sound of what Speaker Pelosi and Leader McConnell have said recently about impeachment in the last few months.
We want to defend that Constitution, which has a republic in it. As Benjamin Franklin said, a republic if you can keep it. We see that as our responsibility to keep the republic instead of an attitude of Article 2 says I can do whatever I want.
We exist because the founders wanted an institution that could stop momentary hysterias and partisan passions from damaging our republic.
Article 2, a reference to the president's constitutional powers. These are both students of history, yes. Both of them. However, they also have an urgent goal, keeping their majorities, a political goal. I want to ask both of you, how do both of these leaders look at the politics? How important is that in their thinking? Nadeem?
Sure. I mean, right now we are sitting here discussing witnesses by Democrats. Democrats are demanding that Leader McConnell provide an opportunity for these witnesses to come before the Senate and say what they know.
But could Pelosi look like she's obstructing the process if she waits too long? And could that hurt some of her vulnerable Democrats?
There's nothing in the Constitution, as my friend Stephen Law said here, that says that the House has to transmit these articles in a certain amount of time. So clearly, she is using this time to make the case. We are protecting the Constitution, we are protecting the institution, and we are trying to ensure that the American people actually get a chance to hear from those witnesses. Look, if I was Leader McConnell, I would think to myself, you know, I want to make sure that the president is fully exonerated. And I have the opportunity to bring before the Senate these witnesses who the president says will exonerate them fully. I would do it in a heartbeat.
Stephen Law?
Sure. A couple things on that. I mean, first of all, I think it's important to point out that the rules that are now likely to be adopted in the Senate to direct the trial are identical to the rules that were agreed upon on a unanimous and bipartisan basis to control the trial in the Senate of the impeachment of William Jefferson Clinton. And under those rules, there's no exclusion of additional evidence, no exclusion of seeing witnesses and taking their testimony, but it starts out on the front end with just receiving the articles and having the case presented by both sides. And then at that point, there's an opportunity, if it is deemed necessary by the Senate, to call witnesses to have additional testimony. So the idea that the Senate is against any potential for witnesses testifying is simply a construct of the other side. The key issue here is simply, does the Senate get to decide its rules versus others, thrusting that upon them? And do we have a procedure that works? I mean, and you asked a minute ago about the politics. I think most people outside of the hothouse that is Washington just are probably viewing impeachment as a piece of overchewed gum. They've heard about it for a long time. A lot of Democrats have been talking about it since the president was inaugurated. And I think they'd like a process that works expeditiously to bring this to whatever conclusion needs to be brought to. And I think the Speaker made a miscalculation deciding to try this sort of a theatrical exercise. I'm going to hold back the articles of impeachment until I get what I want out of the Senate. And now that I think that's starting to fall apart, I think that move is starting to look smaller and more political than I think she wanted it to be.
So much to talk about. We have just 1 minute left. Both of your former bosses are very good vote counters, and few people realize that they don't seem to crack the whip so much as they spend a lot of time knowing their members and working with their members. But clearly the votes right now, Nadeem, are not there to remove this president. And I want to ask both of you quickly, how much do you think this could impact the election in November? What's happening with impeachment now, briefly?
I don't think they're thinking about how it's going to impact the election. I could tell you that for a fact. I think what they're thinking about is how this is going to impact a fair trial in the Senate. And that's why the Speaker did what she is continuing to do, making sure that the Senate has a trial that is fair, that presents all the evidence, and putting some pressure on Leader McConnell to move forward.
Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, it is partly my job to think about the political impact in the elections, and I do kind of doubt that impeachment is going to be the dominant issue in Senate elections next fall. But I do think there are going to be House members, Democrats who ran in districts that Trump won, who promised that they were going to try to work with this president, who are largely now going to be running mostly on impeachment. And for some of them, I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to explain to their constituents.
We'll see. They're talking about other issues now, but I think we'll be talking about this more. Thank you, Nadeem El-Shami, Stephen Law. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Attacks on a U.S. base in Iraq. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps says this attack is in retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani. As we follow that story, we also want to zoom out to talk about the overall strategy toward Iran and the Middle East with two people who know the region well. Mara Karlin worked at the Pentagon during the George W. Bush administration and was appointed to a senior position during the Obama administration. She's now Director of Strategic Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies. And Michael Doran was Senior Director for the Middle East on the National Security Council staff during the George W. Bush administration and is now a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Mara Karlin, let me start with you. I guess I have to get your response. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is taking credit for these attacks and saying that these are rocket attacks from Iran into Iraq at U.S. bases. Could we get your response?
Yes, this is probably the first event that we will see of a slew of others, Nick. The U.S. set a new bar by killing Qasem Soleimani, who we can all agree was a horrific human being who is catastrophic for U.S. national security interests. But in killing him, as I said, it's a new bar. And now the Iranians are starting to retaliate, and I suspect we will see a whole lot more in and around the region over the coming days, weeks, and potentially months.
Michael Doran, some of the critics of this attack, as you know well, were worried about a cycle of escalation happening after this attack. Do you have that worry, especially now as we see, as Mara Karlin says, perhaps the first of a few attacks from Iran?
Well, it didn't start with the attack on Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians have been escalating in a very deliberate fashion since last April. deliberate but incremental. That escalation ended up with the killing of an American. Now we have a new level of escalation where they're attacking us from Iran. We have no choice now whatsoever. We're under attack. This is war. We have no choice but to win the escalation ladder.
Maura Carlin, are you worried about, as Michael Drown just said, the escalation ladder? And do we have no choice? Do we just have to simply keep climbing the ladder, so to speak?
It's profoundly concerning. This has been going on for a while. Both the U.S. and the Iranians have taken a wide variety of escalatory steps. But hitting someone so senior in the Iranian national security apparatus is an entirely different ballgame. It is still unclear why the U.S. hit Soleimani, where they hit him, and when they hit him. And I fear that we are going to spin further out of control without a whole lot of clarity as to why.
Michael Doran, do you believe that the Trump administration has clarity as to why they hit Qasem Soleimani and why this escalation is okay?
Oh, absolutely. The Iranians had made a decision, Qasem Soleimani was implementing it, to throw the United States out of Iraq. That's why they were attacking our bases. That's why they killed an American there. And that's why they attacked the embassy. I mean, we saw it with our own eyes, what was happening. Those militias on the ground in Iraq are armed, trained, equipped, and controlled by Iran. Everyone knows that. That's not what Trump has said to the Iranians is, we're not going to play this game anymore where you hit us with militias and we respond against the militias. We know that you're doing it, and we're going to respond to you. This is not something that Donald Trump brought on the United States. The Iranians have been fighting this war against us now since last April.
Maura Carlin, what about that? The idea that President Trump, by killing Soleimani, has essentially restored deterrence on Iran, and that this was Iran's escalation long before the U.S. escalated.
Look, this is a story that lasts years, to put it lightly, but it is pretty clear that the U.S. and the Iranians are now in a tit-for-tat escalatory spiral. It is hard to imagine how this turns out well. And frankly, Soleimani is probably spinning with delight in his grave. If one of his goals was to push the U.S. military out of Iraq, it appears as though he may be getting that wish sooner rather than later.
Michael Doran, you argued before that Iran was controlling a lot of these militias in Iraq, but of course the U.S. military has great influence over the Iraqi military. It is training the Iraqi military and fighting alongside the Iraqi military with ISIS. But at this point, right now, the Prime Minister of Iraq is suggesting that the U.S. leave. Are you concerned that the Prime Minister has said the U.S. should leave Iraq in response to the U.S. decision to kill Qasem Soleimani?
Well, the Prime Minister is a lame duck, until there's a constitutional crisis in Iraq right now, until we have a new government in place, the statements that he's making don't really matter. And the key question is not whether we stay in Iraq or not. We're under attack as we speak from the IRGC, firing missiles from Iran at an American base. So the question isn't anymore what the Prime Minister of Iraq is saying, what the half of the parliament is saying. The question is, what are we going to do about this direct attack on American forces from the Iranians? And there's no choice here whatsoever. If we're to achieve any of our goals in the Middle East, then we have to demonstrate to the world and to the Iranians that they cannot treat us like this.
Maura Carlin, is that how you see it? Is the response from the Iraqi Prime Minister less important right now? And does the U.S. simply need to respond, again, back where we were, kind of raising up on that escalatory ladder?
Nick, the conversation is completely changed because of this attack. The U.S. and Iraq are divided. The U.S. is divided from its European allies. Iran has been facing the largest protests in 40 years. That is off the headlines. The fight against the Islamic State is now on hold at best. It's a little bit hard to figure out how, as Mike is saying, any sort of deterrence would be restored.
Mike, what about that? The coalition in Iraq did acknowledge that the fight against ISIS was on hold. There have been other side effects of Qasem Soleimani's death. Are you worried about all of that affecting things as the U.S. decides how to respond tonight?
The greatest strategic threat that the United States has faced in the Middle East for the last decade is the rise of Iran across the region, the proliferation of these militias across the Arab world, the distribution to those militias of precision-guided weaponry, and the effort of Iran to use those new positions to undermine the American security system in the region. If we're going to stay in this region and if we are going to lead this region, then we have to demonstrate that we cannot be pushed around by Iran in this way. If we're ever going to achieve an Iran without nuclear weapons, which 4 presidents have said is absolutely unacceptable, then we have to win this round and we have to win it decisively. There's no other choice.
Mara Karlin, in the 45 seconds or so that we have left, Mike Doran brings up that Iran has been spreading missiles throughout the region. This, however, is a response, apparently, from Iran itself, from the Revolutionary Guard. Just explain that significance and how important and how fraught this moment is.
Absolutely. I mean, we are in probably the most tense moment that the U.S. has been in the Middle East for decades, to put it lightly. I mean, easily since the Iraq invasion. What's particularly ironic, however, is that the Trump administration has continued to be, like previous administrations before it, embroiled in Middle East purgatory. Its strategy of focusing on China, of focusing on the real geopolitical challenges, on great power competition, are invariably going to melt away as the Middle East continues to surge to the top of the priority list.
Michael Doran, just in the last few seconds that I have, can you just respond to that, please?
The United States is much more powerful than Iran. Iran is like a puffer fish. It looks powerful because of these militias with these precision-guided weapons and because of its boldness. It's suffering an unprecedented crisis of legitimacy at home. Its position in Iraq has been challenged by protesters on the ground who want Iran out of Iraq. It is behaving in this aggressive fashion in order to look much stronger than it is. We can best this adversary with relative ease.
Michael Doran from the Hudson Institute, Mara Karlin from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Thanks very much to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The long-awaited criminal trial of Harvey Weinstein began in New York City this week. Amna Nawaz has the details.
More than 80 women have accused Weinstein of sexual harassment, assault, or misconduct going back decades. But the New York trial, where jury selection began today, is based on charges brought by 2 women. Weinstein faces 1 count of rape and 1 count of criminal sexual assault. He has maintained his sexual encounters with the women were consensual. Just hours after the trial began, a separate rape charge was brought against Weinstein in California, one of several criminal charges filed in a complaint there. Jodi Kantor, along with fellow New York Times reporter Megan Twohey, first broke the Weinstein story more than 2 years ago, and they co-authored the book She Said. Jodi Kantor joins me now from New York. Jodi, welcome back to the NewsHour. A lot of people will think, when there were so many women who came forward with allegations against Harvey Weinstein, why is this one case based on just the stories of 2 of those women?
Well, remember that so many of the allegations against Harvey Weinstein, if you think of a kind of ocean of complaints out there, are not actually eligible for criminal prosecution. When you apply the statute of limitations, that ocean gets smaller. When you talk about acts that are not just sexual harassment. I mean, many of the allegations against Weinstein are very disturbing. They're tales of harassment, of abusive behavior, but those allegations aren't necessarily criminal. You can't go to jail for them. So the ocean gets smaller then. If you talk about women who are willing to come forward and participate in the process, the ocean gets even smaller. So what we're left with is this very narrow case that stands in contrast to the huge number of allegations against him. But that's part of why the news from Los Angeles about him being charged there was so significant, because it means that Harvey Weinstein is now fighting these kinds of charges on 2 fronts at the same time.
So, Jodi, what about those 2 cases now in New York and Los Angeles? Could they have an impact on each other?
Well, the obvious thing is they significantly increase Harvey Weinstein's legal jeopardy in combination. Even if he gets off in New York, he'll face a trial in LA. Now, what's interesting is that there's a woman, an alleged Weinstein victim, who's actually involved in both cases. She's part of the charges in LA, and she's supposed to be a supporting witness here in New York.
Tell me about that jury selection. Now, the lawyers have to pick 12 judges, 6 alternates from a pool of hundreds of New Yorkers. Especially for a case like this, how critical is that process?
Really critical, really complicated. First of all, remember that conviction requires unanimity from a jury. So the question of the selection of jurors is it's essential both for the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution wants people who will believe these charges. The defense wants people who will be skeptical, who they can create doubt and questions. On the one hand, the defense, I think especially, will have a preference for people who haven't read a lot of the news of this case. On the other hand, given the way it's dominated the news for 2 years, it seems like that will be almost impossible.
You know, Jody, you've been outside of the courthouse. Some of your colleagues have been reporting from inside that courtroom. And Weinstein has already run afoul of the judge in this case. The judge got quite angry with him today. Tell me about what you can share about his conduct, both the way he entered the courtroom and what's been going on inside.
You know, I was standing yesterday morning with a group of alleged Weinstein victims who were waiting outside the courthouse. They wanted to not confront him verbally, but they wanted to look at him in the eye as he came into the courthouse. One of them even said that she had not seen Weinstein since the alleged violation years beforehand. So they were waiting, and he sort of swept into the courthouse without giving them a glance. He was surrounded by his legal team. He was sort of hobbling with a walker. But the judge, Justice Burke, who is a very exacting judge, he's a former prosecutor, has a reputation for being fair but tough. He has already admonished Weinstein in the past. They had a cell phone problem in the courtroom several months ago. Today, apparently, Weinstein did it again, and the judge was very tough on him. He said to him, feels like it could have been a line in a movie, he said to him, "Mr. Weinstein, is this how you want to go to jail for using your cell phone in a courtroom?" He was essentially threatening to remand him to a jail unless Weinstein played by the rules.
A dramatic beginning to a trial that's sure to take several weeks to unfold. Jody Kantor's going to be following it all. Jody, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.